Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's been a really interesting conversation, and that's what this House is all about. And so I've appreciated the range of opinions that have come forward. I appreciated the comments that were made today, many of them clearly impassioned, all informed, and from some extremely valid points of view. And I think, as with all complex issues, and housing is, if nothing else, extraordinarily complex, it's important that we recognize and admit that whatever position we have on this issue, and it's a multifaceted issue, but that the position we have is based on what we know at this time in this place, and that we must always be open to arguments coming from elsewhere, to question our own beliefs, but also to come at this with a set of values, a set of principles that inform what we're trying to achieve. And this motion, for me, reflects the values and the principles of the party I represent, a party which is, at its heart, about ensuring the well-being of islanders, whether that be socially, economically, or in terms of protecting an environment that it will ensure that future generations of islanders are able to meet their needs as we are today. The LPA upon which this motion is based is, of course, a regulation of ownership. I'd like us all to imagine for a moment if the Lands Protection Act did not exist here on Prince Edward Island. What do you think ownership of our land would look like?
That's sobering.
If you stop for a moment and consider that, I suspect we would almost go full circle back to the early 1800s and before, when land ownership was held in an enormous concentration in a few hands, because that's the way that unfettered, unregulated capitalism works. The member from Moraldona made some very valid points, and I listened very carefully, but as I always do to his comments, I appreciate the thoughtfulness that goes into all the contributions that he makes to debates in this House. That yes, we can't draw an exact parallel between land and housing, or water and housing, I think was the other example you used. And we're not looking here for an exact parallel. However, we are looking for a principle which supports the idea that if we accept that housing is a human right, that shelter is an absolute human necessity, and if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the very bottom, those principal requirements for us to have any sort of other goals in life are things like food, water, and shelter, and clothing. There are a couple of others, but those are the foundational needs that we all have. So if we accept that having shelter over your head is a foundational need for all of the citizens of this province, then I would argue that it's incumbent on a government to do what it can to provide that shelter for all islanders. And what this motion does is it suggests that there are things government could do. We have a choice here. We can choose regulation of the marketplace, and the level to which we regulate the marketplace is not prescribed in this motion.
Correct.
What we ask for is the establishment of a commission to look at possible solutions that we could employ here on Prince Edward Island. And we are not alone in experiencing a housing crisis. However, we are perhaps more than any other jurisdiction in Canada. And if you look at Canada and compare our country to the other G7 nations, we are off the chart, literally off the charts, in terms of the ratio between housing affordability and income.
Exactly.
I wish I had the chart in front. I know I couldn't use it Speaker, if I had it in front of me. But if you look at a chart, and the baseline, I believe, goes back to 2005, at the G7 countries, and you look at that ratio of housing prices to wages, you will see that Canada is an outlier by an extreme margin. In some countries, our neighbour to the south, US, housing has actually become more affordable in terms of a ratio between income and prices since 2005. In most other G7 countries, it has increased to varying degrees, but Canada is off the charts. And of course, Prince Edward Island, as we know, within Canada, is a leader when it comes to inflation. Our rent costs have increased over 16% in the last 2 years, compared to very modest increases in most other jurisdictions. So we're looking at a unique problem here on Prince Edward Island, a problem of a runaway growth economy in a small jurisdiction. And of course, we always, be careful what I say here, we imagine that growth is good. And there are many good things that come with a growing economy. Of course there are. But there are downsides to that. And I think we have to ask ourselves when we see growth, particularly the strength of growth that we have experienced in Prince Edward Island over the last little while. Growth for whom? Growth of what? Because if we're growing sectors of the economy which are unsustainable or are drawing down resources, then that could be a problem. Growth at what costs? There are many ways of measuring the health of an economy beyond growth. We have vital signs here, which is, I'm really pleased that we instituted that. I'm really pleased that government came forward with long-term funding for several years of support for vital signs, something which really measures the well-being of the citizens of this province. And part of vital signs, of course, is access to housing. There are many, many, many other aspects of it. But the distinction between something like a well-being index or vital signs as we have here, and there are many others around the world, the distinction is that they do not just look at growth in the economy and say, great, growth is at 4% or 3% or 7% or whatever it is, and assume that things are good, because growth is not always good for everyone. And we need to be really careful. So we have a choice. Are we going to allow the marketplace here on Prince Edward Island to be unregulated and unfettered? I'm talking about the housing market specifically here. Because that seems to be the choice of this administration. And if that is the case, what are the consequences going to be? Well, I think we only need to look backwards at the last few years to see what the consequences of an unregulated housing market are. And it's not pretty. As my colleague said in her remarks from Charlottetown, Victoria Park, when I think of my children and the opportunities that they have to afford to have a house and a roof over their head, it doesn't look good. And while we cannot control, of course, the global economic situation, we can do what we are able to do on Prince Edward Island to create some guardrails, some parameters as to what we will allow to happen. We could do that. This government so far seems unwilling, uninterested to even consider that. We are asking for a commission to be set up to look at what possibilities we could have here should we choose to regulate the housing market. And that could be everything from a vacancy tax, which is being instituted in many places. It could be an increase to the deposit amount required for second and third and fourth and fifth dwellings. It could be regulation in terms of capping ownership. It could be bringing in new tax laws to dissuade and discourage and make it difficult for non-islanders to reap the profits of the housing boom here on Prince Edward Island and take them out of our economy. There are all kinds of things which we could do. And again, it's really important that this House realize that this motion is not saying we need to do this. We are going to make this illegal. We're going to make sure that we're going to do A, B, C, D, E, or F. That's not what this motion is. This motion is saying if we want to make a choice, if we look at the last few years and we don't like what we see in terms of the housing possibilities for our friends and neighbours and our children, then we have an opportunity to do that. And let's establish a commission to look into what's possible, and let's do something to ensure that the future of housing for our friends and neighbours and our children and future generations of islanders is stable. I really hope, despite the comments that I've heard from a couple of members on the government side, that you will consider and read carefully the operative clauses of this motion. Because that's where, in all motions, that's where the meat of the thing lies. I think we need to look for made in PEI solutions for our unique situation here. And I'm not going to go back and repeat the points I made in my opening remarks, but we are in a unique situation, which is why I think the reference to the LPA is useful in framing the concerns that we have here. Let's look for made in PEI solutions which are appropriate for our unique circumstances here. Let's be imaginative, let's be bold, and let's do what we can to ensure that islanders today and into the future have access to that basic human right, which is a roof over their heads. Thank you, Mr.